The cable reached the Ministry of Defense in Whitehall on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1983, marked for the attention of the naval staff. Its contents made an unusual claim: American aviators flying a British aircraft in mock combat against the finest fighters in the United States Navy inventory had produced kill-loss ratios that senior officers in the Pentagon initially refused to circulate. The aircraft was the Sea Harrier FRS.1, then 2 years past its baptism in the South Atlantic. The pilots were from the U.S. Navy's Naval Fighter Weapons School at Miramar, California, better known by the acronym its instructors preferred: Top Gun. The exchange program had been running quietly since 1980, folded into a broader arrangement between the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm and its American counterpart, and the men in the cockpit at Miramar during those dissimilar air combat exercises were flying an aircraft that most American planners had, until Port Stanley, considered a curiosity. The Sea Harrier had been born from a Whitehall compromise. In 1966, Dennis Healey, then Defense Secretary in Harold Wilson's government, had cancelled the CVA-01 large aircraft carrier program, judging Britain could no longer afford fleet carriers on the American model. The Royal Navy's response, worked through over the following decade, was smaller: the Invincible class through-deck cruisers, and an aircraft that could operate from them without catapults or arrestor gear. The Hawker Siddeley P.1127 lineage delivered it. By 1980, 800 Naval Air Squadron had commissioned at Yeovilton with the Sea Harrier FRS.1, armed with the Blue Fox radar, two 30mm Iden cannon in ventral pods, and provision for the AIM-9L Sidewinder. The Americans were curious, and Vice Admiral Robert F. Dunn, later commander of Naval Air Forces Atlantic, had pushed for the exchange visits that would put US Navy pilots into British cockpits. What the American pilots discovered at Yeovilton and later at Miramar, when a small Royal Navy detachment flew Sea Harriers against F-14 Tomcats, F-5s and A-4s in dissimilar combat, ran counter to every assumption. The aircraft was subsonic. Its radar was rudimentary compared to the AWG-9 in the Tomcat. Its endurance was measured in minutes rather than hours, and in close-in engagements, it consistently produced favourable exchange rates. The reason was VIFF, a term that had entered the vocabulary of RAF and Fleet Air Arm Test pilots in the early 1970s, vectoring in forward flight. By rotating the 4 Pegasus engine nozzles from horizontal to a downward angle during a turning fight, a Sea Harrier pilot could bleed forward speed, tighten his turn radius inside anything else airborne, and force an overshooting adversary into his gun sight. The Falklands had already demonstrated something of the aircraft's utility. Between May 1st and June 14th, 1982, Sea Harriers of 800 and 801 squadrons, operating from HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, had claimed 21 Argentine aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, for no losses in the same role. 2 Sea Harriers were lost to ground fire, 4 to accidents. Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse's task force had gone south with 20 of them. By the end of the war, it had lost 6 and gained air superiority over the beachhead. Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward had written in his personal signal traffic that the aircraft's performance had exceeded any reasonable pre-war projection. The Americans read those signals. What they wanted to know in the years that followed was whether the aircraft or the pilots were the anomaly. The answer arrived at Miramar, and it was not the one the Pentagon had expected. Attlee's government inherited an air force that had won the Battle of Britain and a fleet air arm still flying piston-engined Seafires and Fireflies. Within 18 months of Japan's surrender, the shape of the problem had clarified. British defense policy would have to be rebuilt around a hostile Soviet Union, an American ally that had rescinded Lend-Lease in August 1945, and a treasury that regarded every military program as a claim on convertible sterling the country did not possess. The Chiefs of Staff Committee, chaired in that first post-war period by Lord Allenbrook and then Lord Tedder, met weekly in the underground rooms beneath Great George Street. Their assessments, marked top secret and circulated to a distribution of fewer than 30 in Whitehall, warned that the Royal Navy might, within a decade, cease to be capable of independent operations at any significant distance from home waters. The Ministry of Supply, working with the Air Ministry, placed orders for what would become the V-Bomber Force, the Vickers Valiant, the Avro Vulcan, and the Handley Page Victor. The first specification, B.35/46, had been issued in January 1947. The aircraft that met it were flying by the mid-1950s, and the deterrent role that fell to them was the strategic centerpiece of British defense policy until Polaris. Alongside the bombers came the atomic weapons themselves, developed under William Penny at Fort Halstead and Aldermaston, tested at Montebello in October 1952, and first delivered operationally as Blue Danube in November 1953. Duncan Sandys' 1957 Defence White Paper had then argued in a passage that produced a decade of controversy that manned fighter aircraft would be superseded by guided missiles. The paper cancelled or curtailed a range of aircraft programs and reoriented fighter command around the English Electric Lightning and, in due course, surface-to-air missiles. The Royal Navy's problem was different in shape and identical in substance. The wartime fleet had numbered 52 aircraft carriers of various types. By 1960, the operational carrier force had fallen to 4, and Admiralty planners were engaged in an argument with the Treasury over whether even that number could be sustained. The carriers HMS Ark Royal and HMS Eagle had been rebuilt with angled decks, mirror landing sites, and steam catapults during the 1950s, incorporating 3 British inventions that transformed carrier aviation worldwide. The fleet air arm operated the Blackburn Buccaneer, the de Havilland Sea Vixen, and from 1968, the F-4 Phantom II, purchased from McDonnell Douglas with British Rolls-Royce Spey engines. The Phantom entered service on Ark Royal with 892 Naval Air Squadron in 1969. 6 years later, the government had decided the carrier would pay off. Healey's 1966 Defence Review had made the decision. CVA-01, the projected replacement fleet carrier, would not be built. The RAF under Sir Charles Elworthy had argued that land-based aircraft could cover the requirement east of Suez. The Navy under Admiral Sir David Luce argued the opposite, and Luce resigned. The withdrawal from east of Suez, announced by Wilson in January 1968, closed the strategic argument. The Navy would retain amphibious and anti-submarine capability, but would lose its fixed-wing strike aircraft when Ark Royal decommissioned. That happened in 1978. For 18 months, the Royal Navy possessed no fixed-wing carrier aviation at all. Into that gap came an aircraft whose origins predated the cuts. The P.1127 first hovered at Dunsfold in October 1960 under the hands of Bill Bedford, a Hawker test pilot who had flown Hurricanes over Malta. Bedford's first free hover had been conducted with the aircraft tethered by steel cables, and the Pegasus engine, built by Bristol Siddeley under Stanley Hooker, had produced a whistling scream that carried across the Surrey aerodrome. The vectored thrust principle had come from a French engineer, Michel Wibeau, whose sketches had reached the Ministry of Supply in 1956 and been passed to Hooker's team at Bristol. What emerged over the following decade was the Kestrel evaluation aircraft, tested by a tripartite squadron of British, American and West German pilots at RAF West Raynham in 1965, and then the Harrier GR1, which entered RAF service with one squadron at Wittering in April 1969. The RAF flew it from dispersed sites in West Germany, hidden in wooded clearings, camouflaged against Soviet air attack on the fixed airfields the Warsaw Pact had catalogued in exhaustive detail. The naval version had been slower in coming. Admiralty enthusiasm for a subsonic vertical landing aircraft had been muted throughout the 1960s. What changed the argument was the loss of the fixed-wing carrier force. If the Invincible-class ships were to have any air component beyond helicopters, it would have to be an aircraft that could operate without catapults. British Aerospace, formed from the 1977 merger of Hawker Siddeley and the British Aircraft Corporation, took the Harrier airframe, fitted a larger radome housing the Ferranti Blue Fox pulse-modulated radar, raised the cockpit for better visibility, and added the plumbing for sidewinder pylons. The result was the Sea Harrier FRS.1. The Ministry of Defence placed an order for 24 aircraft in May 1975, later increased. First flight was in August 1978. 700A Naval Air Squadron, the Intensive Flying Trials Unit, formed at Yeovilton in September 1979. The ski jump was the other British contribution. Lieutenant Commander Doug Taylor, a Royal Navy officer working on his master's dissertation at Southampton University in the early 1970s, had calculated that a curved ramp at the bow of a ship would allow a Harrier to launch at a higher weight and lower forward speed than a flat deck could accommodate. The mathematics were straightforward once someone had thought to work them. The trials conducted with a land-based ramp at RAE Bedford confirmed the calculations. HMS Hermes was fitted with a 12-degree ramp during her 1980-81 refit. HMS Invincible had been completed with a 7-degree ramp from the outset. By April 1982, when the Argentine junta ordered the occupation of the Falkland Islands, the Royal Navy possessed 20 Sea Harriers in operational squadrons and a handful more at Yeovilton. The Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Terence Lewin, had briefed Margaret Thatcher on the Sunday after the invasion that a task force could be assembled and dispatched south. The air component would be 20 Sea Harriers. Against them, the Argentine Air Force and naval aviation could field an inventory, including Mirage 3s, Israeli-built daggers, a 4 Skyhawks and Super Etendards, armed with the Exocet AM-39 anti-ship missile. Argentine pilot training was rated by the Defense Intelligence Staff in an assessment circulated on April 5, 1982, as competent to good. Argentine aircraft numbers exceeded the British by a factor of 5 or more. The task force sailed on April 5th. What happened between May 1st and June 14th was watched, with particular attention, by the US Navy attaché in London. Sharkey Ward commanded 801 Naval Air Squadron aboard HMS Invincible during the campaign. Nigel David Ward, known by the call sign Sharkey since his time flying Phantoms with the Royal Navy in the early 1970s, was a commander in the Fleet Air Arm and had spent the years preceding the war arguing, sometimes to the point of institutional friction, that the Sea Harrier could hold its own against faster adversaries, provided its pilots understood what it could and could not do. His squadron's tactics, refined during workups off Portland and in exercises with the Royal Navy's air defence frigates, emphasised low-level intercepts, aggressive use of the Blue Fox radar in a look-down mode against sea clutter, and the exploitation of the AIM-9L Sidewinder's all-aspect capability. The AIM-9L, provided by the United States on an emergency basis in the days after the task force sailed, was the version that could be fired from any angle around a target, rather than only from the rear quarter. Andy Auld commanded 800 Squadron on HMS Hermes. His aircraft carried a different mix, more oriented toward ground attack. Between them, the two squadrons flew combat air patrols over the task force, and later over San Carlos water, in weather that ranged from the marginal to the appalling. Deck launches took place in swells that pitched the flight deck through 20 feet of vertical travel. Recoveries were made at night, in fog, onto ships blacked out for operational reasons. The loss rate to accidents and hostile fire combined was 6 aircraft from a starting inventory of 20, a rate that would have been considered severe in a longer campaign. The sortie generation rate, measured against aircraft available, exceeded planning assumptions throughout May and into June. The first air-to-air kill was recorded on May 1, 1982. Flight Lieutenant Paul Barton of 801 Squadron, an RAF pilot flying with the Royal Navy on exchange, shot down a Mirage 3 of Grupo 8 with an AIM-9L over Pebble Island. On the same day, Flight Lieutenant Steve Thomas destroyed a second Mirage. Lieutenant Commander Mike Broadwater and Lieutenant Al Curtis added others. Over the following 6 weeks, Sea Harriers claimed a Canberra, further Mirages and Daggers, and in the campaign's most concentrated air fighting on May 21st over San Carlos, 4 Skyhawks. Lieutenant Commander Nigel Ward himself, on June 1st, shot down a C-130 Hercules, attempting to shadow the task force. The final total, established by post-war analysis matching British claims against Argentine loss records, stood at 21 aircraft destroyed in air combat. No Sea Harrier was lost in air-to-air combat. 2 were lost to ground fire, including Lieutenant Nick Taylor of 800 Squadron, killed by 35mm anti-aircraft fire over Goose Green on May 4th, and a third to a suspected engagement whose circumstances remained ambiguous. Others were lost to accidents. The Argentine Air Force lost, across all causes, approximately a third of its combat inventory. The Exocet threat, borne by 5 Super Étendards operating from Rio Grande, produced the losses that shaped the political memory of the war. HMS Sheffield on May 4th, the Atlantic Conveyor on May 25th. Neither was engaged by Sea Harrier CAP because neither was where the CAP had been positioned. The Defense Intelligence Staff Assessment of Sea Harrier performance, completed in July 1982 and circulated to the Chiefs of Staff, arrived at the American attaché's desk in London within weeks. The naval attaché at the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square routed the assessment to the Pentagon, and within the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, it produced a request for more information than the summary contained. The US Navy had, since 1976, operated the AV-8A Harrier with the Marine Corps, principally with Squadron VMA-231 at Cherry Point. Marine Corps enthusiasm for the aircraft had never translated into US Navy interest in a fleet fighter version. The AV-8A had been treated as a close air support platform, useful for supporting amphibious operations and no more. The Falklands data suggested something the American service had not considered, that a subsonic aircraft with a modest radar could produce combat outcomes against fast jets that were not merely acceptable, but favorable. The pilot exchange program provided the mechanism. 2 US Navy pilots at a time were seconded to the Royal Navy's Sea Harrier training pipeline, flying with 899 Naval Air Squadron at Yeovilton, the headquarters and training squadron for the type. The reciprocal flow sent Royal Navy pilots to fly F-14S and F-18S in American squadrons. The program had begun before the Falklands and continued afterwards, and the American officers who passed through Yeovilton in 1983, 1984 and 1985 returned to San Diego and to Miramar with a body of practical experience. At Miramar, the arrangements were more elaborate. Top Gun, formerly the Navy Fighter Weapons School, existed to train the fighter community's most demanding pilots in dissimilar air combat. Its adversary squadron flew A-4 Skyhawks and F-5E Tiger IIs, small and agile aircraft chosen to simulate the Soviet MiG-21 and MiG-17. When Sea Harriers were made available for evaluation exercises against Top Gun students and instructors, the results caused genuine puzzlement. In turning engagements, the Sea Harrier could not be reliably outmaneuvered by the F-14 Tomcat, an aircraft with more than twice the thrust, 3 times the fuel, and a radar of an entirely different generation. What the Sea Harrier could do in the hands of a pilot who understood VIFF was rotate its thrust vector, decelerate through an attacker's firing solution, and reverse the geometry of the engagement in a matter of seconds. Lieutenant Commander John Nichol, a US Navy exchange pilot who flew the Sea Harrier extensively during this period, is reported in accounts collected by the RAF Historical Society to have observed that pilots trained to fight in the horizontal, as most American fighter pilots were, found themselves suddenly fighting an aircraft that could operate in the vertical without regard to airspeed. The evaluation reports, classified at their inception and released in fragments over subsequent decades, described exchange ratios in favor of the Sea Harrier that varied with the exercise conditions but were consistently better than pre-trial estimates had predicted. Some accounts, including those recorded by Sharkey Ward in his 1992 memoir, cite figures approaching 4-1 in favor of the British aircraft in specific engagements. Other American sources describe the results more cautiously. What was not disputed was the direction of the finding. The Pentagon received the assessments. The Marine Corps used them to argue for the AV-8B Harrier II program, which delivered a significantly improved aircraft to VMA 331 in 1985. The US Navy did not procure a Sea Harrier equivalent, judging the F-14 and F-18 sufficient for its purposes. Yet the operational analysis community at the Naval Air Systems Command retained the exchange data. The Joint Intelligence Committee, meeting in the Cabinet Office room reserved for it, considered the American reaction in a broader frame. The JIC's weekly survey of intelligence distributed to the Prime Minister and a small circulation of ministers and officials had noted through the middle years of the 1980s that the shape of British defence exports and technical cooperation with the United States had been altered by the Falklands. The Sea Harrier was the visible symbol of an argument that reached further, that British aeronautical engineering, working within tight budgets, had produced aircraft, ships and weapons whose combat performance the Americans found instructive. The Trident procurement decision taken by Thatcher's government in 1980 for the C-4 missile and later revised to D-5, and the maintenance of a strategic nuclear force, independent of American operational control, sat alongside conventional programs that included the Type 22 frigate, the Chieftain and Challenger main battle tanks, and the Tornado in its air defence and strike variants. British defence spending in 1983 stood at approximately 5.2% of GDP, higher than the NATO European average and lower than the American figure. The Ministry of Defence employed directly and through the industrial base more than 500,000 people. The Royal Air Force operated Vulcans until 1984, when the last squadron disbanded, and by then the airborne leg of the nuclear deterrent had passed formally to the Royal Navy's Polaris submarines of the Resolution class operating from Faslane on the Clyde. The Resolution boats, HMS Resolution, HMS Repulse, HMS Renown and HMS Revenge, maintained a continuous at-sea deterrent from 1969 onwards. One boat always at sea, one refitting, one working up, one in reserve. The pattern would transfer to the Vanguard class carrying Trident from 1994. Whitehall's assessment of the American relationship, drafted in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and coordinated through the Cabinet Office, treated the technical exchange with the US Navy as one strand of a much wider pattern. The intelligence sharing arrangements under UK-USA, dating from 1946, and expanded through the following decades, provided GCHQ at Cheltenham with signals intelligence in volumes that no European partner approached. The Menwith Hill Station in North Yorkshire, operated jointly with the National Security Agency, processed Soviet communications traffic on a scale that made the British contribution to Western intelligence disproportionate to national size. Secret Intelligence Service liaison with the Central Intelligence Agency, the routine of Chief of SIS and Director of Central Intelligence Exchanges, produced operational cooperation that survived the periodic difficulties in the political relationship. Against this backdrop, the Sea Harrier's Top Gun performance was, in one sense, a small matter. It concerned a single aircraft type and a series of exercises against a limited set of adversaries. Yet the reports mattered to the people who read them because they answered a question the Americans had been asking, sometimes explicitly, and sometimes not since 1945. What did the British bring to the alliance beyond history and geography? The answer in the case of the Sea Harrier was a specific technical solution to a specific problem, produced by a country that could not afford supersonic naval aviation and had built something else instead. The Cold War's final years brought other tests of the arrangement. The Reykjavik Summit of October 1986, the INF Treaty of December 1987, the German reunification negotiations of 1990. In each, the British voice at the table carried the weight that operational credibility had earned. Charles Powell, Thatcher's private secretary for foreign affairs, drafted the record of the Prime Minister's conversations with Ronald Reagan and George Shultz throughout this period. His notes, later deposited in the Churchill Archives Centre at Cambridge, show a relationship in which British technical and intelligence contributions brought influence disproportionate to raw military mass. Thatcher's insistence during the Reykjavik aftermath that the Western position on nuclear weapons must not be improvised, articulated in her Camp David meeting with Reagan on November 15, 1986, drew force from the fact that the Royal Navy was operating a continuous at-sea deterrent, and Britain had committed to Trident procurement. The argument that Britain would maintain an independent nuclear force was not, in Washington eyes, a rhetorical position. It was underwritten by 4 submarines at Faslane, and the political will to sustain them. The Sea Harrier's operational life continued through the decade. HMS Illustrious commissioned in 1982, HMS Ark Royal, the 5th ship of the name and 2nd of the Invincible class, in 1985. The 3-carrier arrangement, with 1 ship always operational, sat at the centre of the Royal Navy's fleet structure. Sea Harriers flew from all 3, and from HMS Hermes until her paying off in 1985, and sailed to India. The FRS.1 was upgraded to FA.2 standard from the early 1990s, gaining the Blue Vixen pulse Doppler radar and the AIM-120 AMRAAM medium-range missile. The upgraded aircraft would fly operationally over Bosnia and Kosovo. By that point, the strategic argument that had produced the Invincible class had itself evolved, and the ships were operating as light strike carriers as much as anti-submarine platforms. The Cold War's ending, in the period between the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991, arrived at British defence planning as both vindication and disruption. Vindication because the strategic position adopted in 1948 by the Attlee government, and sustained by every successor administration through options for change in 1990, had held. The Warsaw Pact had dissolved without a shot fired across the intra-German border. Disruption because the force structures designed for that confrontation now required redesign for a threat picture whose contours were unclear. The Defense Secretary Tom King's Options for Change announcement of July 25, 1990, reduced the British Army of the Rhine, drew down the RAF's German-based squadrons, and revised the Royal Navy's escort force. The Sea Harrier squadrons survived. So did the Fleet Air Arms aviation role. The technical exchange with the United States continued. In 1990, the Royal Air Force ordered the Harrier GR7, the British version of the AV-8B Harrier II, produced through a McDonnell Douglas British aerospace collaboration. The Harrier lineage that had begun with Bedford's tethered hover at Dunsfold in 1960 remained in service into the 21st century. The Sea Harrier itself was withdrawn from Royal Navy service in 2006, a decision that produced considerable controversy in the naval aviation community, and among those who had flown it against the Argentine Air Force 24 years earlier. What the Pentagon had received in the mid-1980s was, in retrospect, an artifact of a particular moment. The Sea Harrier's success at Miramar depended on the specific characteristics of dissimilar air combat exercises within visual range and against the aircraft available as adversaries. In the beyond visual range engagements that would come to dominate air combat in the following decades, its rudimentary radar and subsonic speed would have been decisive disadvantages. Yet within its envelope, the aircraft had done what its designers had claimed it would do. It had operated from small ships in appalling weather, defeated a numerically superior air force, and produced training data that senior American officers found sufficiently arresting to circulate outside normal channels. Vice Admiral Dunn, who had championed the exchange program, told the U.S. Naval Institute's proceedings in a later interview that the Sea Harrier had forced a generation of American fighter pilots to reconsider what they had been taught about turn rate, thrust vectoring, and the geometry of close-in combat. The comment appeared in print in 1998, 7 years after the Cold War's formal end. The papers of the Sea Harrier's operational deployment lie in several collections. The National Archives at Kew hold in the ADM and DEFE series, the Ministry of Defence's records of the aircraft's development, procurement, and Falklands service, released progressively under the 30-year rule and, in some cases, held back under longer closure. The Imperial War Museum holds Rear Admiral Woodward's papers relating to the task force. The Fleet Air Arm Museum at Yeovilton, which is both an aviation museum and the location of the squadron the aircraft flew from, holds a Sea Harrier FRS.1 in the markings of 801 Naval Air Squadron, along with the pilot's flying kit worn by Sharkey Ward. The RAF Museum at Hendon holds a Harrier GR3 in the desert camouflage worn by one squadron aircraft during the Falklands. The Churchill Archives Centre at Cambridge holds the Powell Papers. Sharkey Ward wrote his account, Sea Harrier, over the Falklands in 1992. His tone was combative and his judgments of some of his contemporaries were not always shared by those contemporaries. Andy Auld did not write a memoir. Bill Bedford, the test pilot who first hovered the P.1127, died in 1996. Doug Taylor, the officer who calculated the ski jump, was awarded the OBE and returned to the naval architecture community. Dennis Healy, who had cancelled CVA-01 in 1966, lived until 2015 and defended the decision to the end. He argued in his memoirs that the Sea Harrier and Invincible class combination had provided the Royal Navy with a more flexible capability than the fleet carrier would have done, and at a fraction of the cost. The judgment is not universally accepted. Naval historians, including Eric Grove and Norman Freedman, have written that the small carrier decision constrained British power projection in ways that were not tested until 1982, and would not have survived a war fought in a different geography. The counter-argument made by others, including Peter Hennessy in his work on Cold War Whitehall, is that British defence policy from 1945 to 1991 was an exercise in doing what could be afforded, and that the Sea Harrier represented the outcome that intelligent compromise had produced. Both positions have supporting evidence. What the exchange program with the US Navy demonstrated in the middle years of the 1980s was that a British aircraft designed to a British specification, operated by British pilots, had produced combat performance that the world's largest naval air arm found sufficiently unexpected to require investigation. The cables that reached the Ministry of Defence in the spring of 1983, and the further correspondence that followed, form part of the archival record of a Cold War in which Britain remained a middle power that punched above its arithmetic weight. The Sea Harrier's story is one instance of that pattern. The last FRS-1 flew from Yeovilton in 1995. The last FA-2 flew in 2006. The Argentine Air Force did not return to the Falklands.